This is from The Grand Promise, Chapter 1. Christmas Eve, 1935. Carter Price panted down the highway from his wife's house in the dark, the bruises on his face pulsing with his heartbeat, the rifle blast during their argument still ringing in his ears. He'd really messed it up with her this time. The cold air stung his lungs, and he was nearly out of breath from running through the snow. Too bad he tossed his whiskey bottle during his fight with her new fellow. A swig of that would help against the cold and bring a bright clarity to his mind. Carter knew she would call the sheriff, was always looking for an excuse to do that. The first place the sheriff would come looking for him was his father's house. Everyone in town knew he was staying there since she'd kicked him out. The fishing tackle bag he'd retrieved from his former garage bounced against his hip as he jogged, and he slowed to a brisk walk, his brain racing, the whiskey wearing off as he thought of what to do next.
That was Rebekah Anderson reading from her historical novel, The Grand Promise. Hi, I'm Alan Rose. Welcome to Book Chat. We're excited to have Rebekah here with us. Thank you for coming down from Seattle today.
Glad to be here.
Great. Rebekah, you have written a novel about a very important time in Pacific Northwest history with the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. And you've really told a story from the human point of view of the people that it affected. You talk about the grand promise that the dam provided, particularly during the Depression and such, but also the high cost that was exacted from creating this marvel. How did you come to write this story?
It's an actually really interesting story. My mom and I went on a road trip several years ago, and we were out in eastern Washington, and we went to the area where my grandfather grew up, which is Bossburg. It's actually north of Kettle Falls, and we went to see the family homestead where he was born, and there are still pieces of it left. And then we went to where the town of Bossburg was, and she was explaining to me that it didn't exist anymore because Lake Roosevelt had backed up that far, and the town had was no longer there. It was parts of it were under the river, parts of it had just fallen away. Mm-hmm. And I had never heard this history before. My grandfather had never mentioned it, and I was intrigued by this. And as we were driving around, I started doing some research about the area and learned more and more about the impacts in the Kettle Falls area from the Grand Coulee Dam. And it seemed like a story that it was becoming lost from living memory. Mm-hmm. And I felt like that was important to capture the impacts to the communities there.
The story is loosely based on your family. With what your mother told you then, how did you go about then researching further into your family history, and how did you know what to use from your family history and what imagination to bring to that with the creation of the Price family?
Right. Well, that was actually an interesting writer's dilemma in some ways, right? About how much do I really want to stay faithful to my family experience there, and how much was it more important to me to tell the bigger story? And I really decided to go with the bigger story. So the Price family is very loosely based on my family. Carter is based on my grandfather. Ozzie is based on my great-grandfather, who I never met, but is sort of notorious in our family as being this character. Mm-hmm. They did really run a ferry operation in the area, but they moved away before the dam was built, so I sort of depart with history there. But the characters are inspired by them, mm-hmm. And their dynamic is inspired by them, and the bigger circumstances are inspired by them. But the rest of it was really researched. That was what prompted the story, but then the rest came about from all of the rich history in the area that I discovered at exploring this as a person who learned this about my own family.
How did you do the research on Kettle Falls and other communities that were submerged with the building of the Grand Coulee and the creation of Lake Roosevelt?
I found some really helpful resources from historical societies. There was a publication about the history of Kettle Falls that was a spiral-bound booklet that I found in an interpretive center at one of the parks there. Huge resource for me. Also, a book called Harnessing the Dream, which is a pretty comprehensive history of the Grand Coulee Dam. It starts with, the geologic history of the area, all the way through irrigation concerns of the 1920s, into the construction, and then even on into the 50s and 60s as the dam was extended. So that was a great resource for me. But really, the anecdotal stories that I found from historical societies, copies of newspaper articles about people in the area, which gave it some texture for me, versus just like, the straightforward history book about, the factual sequencing of the construction. Right. So those human stories really came from those historical society publications, and also looked at some newspaper microfiche. Actually, this is how long I've been working on this book. From the Kettle Falls Library was really helpful. Just kind of seeing what people were talking about in the newspaper back then.
You have one part of the book that I really enjoyed was the multiple points of view that you bring in. You have different, very much living people in your pages who are affected in different ways. Carter Price, the young man, is looking for a fresh start. And with it being the Depression, he sees jobs and a way to sort of build back his life. Whereas his father, Ozzie Price, sees basically the end of a life that he's known, with the ending of the ferry and then the loss of his house. You've got M.J. Starks, was he based on a real person?
Kind of. He's a composite of some people. Okay.
Who's coming in to build the dam with his construction company, and he's got his view about progress and such. And then I really enjoyed the reporter. You've got Harold Burns, who brings sort of the long view to this whole thing. He sees, yes, the advantages, the progress, that will come, but he also sees the loss that is happening, and at the end he questions, how will we weigh this, the progress versus the loss. So in creating these different people, you've got them anecdotally through studying the records. Were they composites, or were there any that were based on actual people?
I got some feedback on an early version of the story that I was really working with my family history to begin with, and had someone read it, and they said, this sort of feels like we are in a town and the only car we have available to us is Carter, and so everything we see is from Carter's perspective, and so we're not really getting the full picture of the impacts to the larger town. And I really took that to heart, and I thought through what different characters could represent the overall impact of this project. And the newspaper character came about as sort of like a Greek chorus type of a function, where he actually has the ability to opine on it big picture, like you mentioned, versus each of the other individual characters have a very personal stake in the outcome or the impacts and outcome of this. And some of them came from the anecdotal history that I read. Charlotte Powell is an example of that. She's actually my favorite character.
She's my favorite character too.
An widowed orchardist who's sort of learned to live independently and kind of thinks this whole thing is a bunch of nonsense, but is still impacted and actually ultimately has a very important role in the outcome of the town. M.J. Starks is a composite of historical figures who were very active in getting the dam built. So there were political activists who were part of getting it green-lighted for construction. And then there were also people who bid on the actual construction, private enterprise that bid on. So he's a composite of some of those characters.
I see.
Who have a different interest in that, right? He doesn't have any kind of personal stake in this other than his business. he gets to leave when it's over with.
Right.
And
right.
doesn't have to face the consequences of it, for good or for bad. He
Yeah.
doesn't realize much of the benefits, and he doesn't have to face any of the consequences.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be representative of all of the different perspectives that came into a project like this.
Mhm.
This is just one of many examples of public works projects like this that happened in that era.
Right.
And so just wanted to kind of take that feedback to not keep it so narrowly focused on my family history and kind of broaden the perspective
Yeah.
with some characters who could represent different perspectives on the impacts of it.
I thought that the one of the strengths of your story was the multiple points of view. I really enjoyed that, and particularly at the beginning, you have these different individuals. We know their stories. We see the impacts that are going to be coming. Some are looking forward to these new developments. A number are fearful. And I'm so glad to hear that Charlotte was your favorite character, because she was my favorite character too. We have here sort of the ideal pioneer woman. You know, she's lost her husband, she's lost her son, she's now in charge of the orchard, and she's handling it all herself. And there's just this matter-of-factness about her that she's going to get on with life. And I loved her sort of mentoring role to some of the younger women. So she was a wonderful creation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Certainly, a people who lost a lot were the indigenous people who had lived there for decades, centuries, and had depended upon the Upper Columbia for their fishing. What type of research did you do for their story?
A lot of that factual information was in some of the history books that I read, but I also reached out to the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. They had some great resources on their website about the history of the area and where, so that reservation is a consolidation of several tribes from other areas. So at that time, they were not living on their traditional lands. They had all been moved, or many of them had been moved over to this new area. And so there was this already a feeling of disenfranchisement, right? That you've been moved from your traditional lands. And then, but on their site, they had where the original areas were, so you could kind of see the progression. And I tried to build that into the journey that Carter and Joe take up the river. That you can, he talks about what these areas used to be used for, or who lived here previously, and that they'd all been moved around. So that was a really great resource for me. I also worked with them and others to find a sensitivity reader from the Native American community to look at the manuscript before it was published. Great. And that was actually a really rewarding, and you know, had to be very vulnerable, you know, in that experience. But I really think that helped with making sure that that experience was represented in a sensitive and honest way.
I'm interested, did the sensitivity reader, what did she or he give you in terms of feedback?
Really good feedback, actually. And I think that part of, I had to really just take a look at what I was saying and how I was saying it before delivering it. And got good feedback that it felt very fair and authentic and handled sensitively. I want to reuse that word too, but you know, like overuse the word. But so I was really glad to have that experience and that collaboration.
That's great. That's great. Joe, was he Nez Perce Indian?
No, he's from the Palouse tribe, I believe.
Palouse. Okay. Well, he was another favorite character of mine. Here is this Native American who loves to read and has these meetings with other construction workers where they're reading classics. And I thought that was a phenomenal touch. It was really nice. Was he based on any actual character?
No. And I also, with that character, I really wanted to subvert that trope of the Native American sidekick to the, you know, Western hero, and they really have a reversed relationship.
Right.
That Joe is the cool one, and Joe is the one that Carter looks up to. He sort of mentors him with the social scene at the dam, and has a little bit. Carter really looks up to him because Joe knows who he is and doesn't have that same sense of kind of listlessness that Carter does.
Right. Joe also sort of has the same characteristics as Charlotte in sort of accepting life on its own terms as it comes. He's not bitter. He's not angry. He's just accepting life as it flows. Yeah. Rebekah, you went to New York University for your Master's of Fine Arts, and here I'm very envious. You were able to study under the great novelist E.L. Doctorow, author of Billy Bathgate, Ragtime, The March. I'm dying to know, what was he like as an instructor, but also what was he like as a person?
It was such an honor to get to work with him, and I had to apply to be part of his mentor group. He had this very mischievous twinkle, and when he was teaching, when I was there, he was not there very much anymore. He was sort of phasing out a bit in his career as a teacher. But he taught this amazing class where we had to read a novel every week, and then the students presented on it. So you had to keep up with this pretty heavy pace of reading. And he actually turned me on to one of my favorite books, Moby Dick, which I probably would have never, stuck it through, but I had to read it for his class. And he gave us spring break, and I literally laid on my bed for 2 weeks reading Moby Dick because I didn't want to not fulfill this assignment for him, because I was so honored to be in this class. But what I didn't really understand it until later, but what he taught us to do in this class was to speed read through these books to really sort of take into your brain a very high level view of it, because you couldn't stop and nerd out on the language. Really, you really had to power through these books in order to keep up with this curriculum and follow the presentations that the students were making. And so that was a really interesting experience for me, because it sort of forced me to read books in a new way, where I was really thinking about them in this sort of scan, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And it helped me with some perspective on construction of a novel-length book, that when you're thinking about it in that sort of skimmed way, you're really thinking about the major components of it, the key plot points, the key character arcs, and less about getting deep down into the language and nitty-gritty of it, which you need to do ultimately, but there was something about that experience that really clicked in my brain about how to construct narrative.
Reading a novel a week, particularly something as huge as Moby Dick, so taking this speed reading or scanning approach that you're suggesting that he asked for, gave you a sense of structure, novel structure. Okay.
Because that was all you could really take away when you're plowing through something that quickly.
Interesting.
And a lot of the books that he assigned were the plots were borrowed from previous works, like classic works or mythic works, which I thought was an interesting choice too. And I really think he was subtle about it, but I think what he was doing was forcing us to think about how narrative is constructed, and that was really helpful to me.
That's great.
And then when we were working together, he actually saw an early version of this as my thesis. He gave a lot of advice about research that was really helpful. Obviously, he is sort of the seminal historical fiction guy. And he gave some good advice about being careful about research, not becoming a way to procrastinate from getting writing done. And that also to remember that ultimately you are writing fiction, and it's okay to take license with it. And I think there are two camps in the historical fiction community about this. There's the side that really is committed to keeping it very factually accurate, And then there's this camp, which I think of as the doctoral camp of like, it's okay to play a little fast and loose with it as long as like the capital T truth is honored. And that ultimately you're writing fiction, it needs to be plausible and believable, but that you're writing about a higher truth, not, it's not a history book per se.
Right, right. So when you entered the MFA program, was your intention to write historical fiction specifically?
No, and I still don't intend to exclusively write historical fiction. I feel like I write literary fiction that is often about the past.
Right. Good point.
I'm not particularly interested in writing contemporary stories for some reason, so I'm sort of somewhere in the middle of these things, I guess.
Okay. So what are you working on now? Is it anything to follow up with the Grand Promise?
Yes, so my next project, I want to adapt it as an audio play, and I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. It could either be a podcast style or maybe a collaboration with radio station or something along those lines. But I just think based on the importance of radio in the era that this is set in the 1930s,
right, that
it would work really well to serialize this as an audio play, and so that's my next project.
Great. That's great. How exciting. Well, Rebekah, it's been great to talk with you about your work and the process you went through in creating this story, partly based on your family history, and also the influence of E.L. Doctorow on your writing. So thank you so much for coming down and joining us.
I appreciate you having me.
Okay.